Thanks everyone for joining our October hack. A few housekeeping notes are please make sure to mute when you're not speaking. And we do encourage you to join on video. So there is a bit more of a community feel, which we like to do for our monthly hacks. I'm using this word hacks. You might be interested in what that stands for. A lot of you are returning members. HACK stands for Housing Action Coalition. And the HACK series is hosted by SV at Home, a monthly discussion-based, action-oriented event that we host, which we typically have on the fourth Friday of the month at noon, with the goal of digging into a hot or current housing-related topic. We have a large enough group where I'd encourage everyone to introduce themselves in the chat. Please include your name and if you'd like where you're calling in from, as well as the organization you're affiliated with, anything else about what brought you here today to learn about our exciting topic. And it looks like just scrolling through, we have a super neat diversity of backgrounds in terms of what type of work folks are doing related to affordable housing, where people are calling in from, and it's really exciting to see. We're going to have a great discussion today. All right, I'll go ahead and introduce our guest speaker today, Arthur Gailes. Arthur is the Fair Housing Coordinator at the Othering and Belonging Institute at UC Berkeley, where he contributes to the Fair Housing Research Initiative and the Opportunity Mapping Project. His work focuses on the geospatial mapping of inequality of opportunity using GIS, R, Python to collect and present data that allows for actionable insight. Arthur specializes in data analysis, econometrics, and policy research. And today he's going to present on the remedies, solutions, and targets that his team identified to address the persistent problem of racial residential segregation in the San Francisco Bay Area by applying novel research methods and fresh analytical tools. Thanks, Arthur, for joining us.
Thank you for having me, and thank you for the very generous introduction. Give me just one moment to share my slideshow, and I will get started. Okay, so I'm going to call my presentation today Opportunity and Where to Find It, How Segregation and Zoning Restrictions Cause a Housing Crisis. And to start off, I want to start by kind of defining opportunity so that we're all kind of working from the same concepts. When we think about opportunity at the Othering and Belonging Institute, we typically think about the complete set of pathways that are available for people to achieve better lives and resources and how they move along these set of pathways. That can be upward mobility, it can be higher educational attainment, it can be happier family and home life. In any way that you might think about it, we want to measure the systems that lead to people having a greater opportunity of achieving it. To think about opportunity in an empirical sense, we start from three, we can think of them as axioms. The first being where we live determines our life outcomes, that broadly place matters. The second being that the structures and institutions in our living environment can either limit or promote fair access to opportunity. And these institutions can be very wide, from community centers and churches to schools that are local to you. The more that we have, the more that we give people a foundation for improvement, the more improvement we'll see in the world. And then these structures also define neighborhoods as being opportunity rich and opportunity poor. And they in particular they show very large differences both within and across incomes and races. To measure opportunity, we try to identify indicators or proxies by which we can measure it, because opportunity is kind of a qualitative concept. It's not something we can put a number on directly. So to get at the amount of opportunity in any particular neighborhood, we measure the different proxies that we might use to assess whether it's providing its residents with opportunity. And those can be schools, they can be libraries, they can be incomes, or they can be environmental hazards. This is an example of one of the opportunity mapping models that we may use. We have several different ones that we apply to different policies. And In this case, we measure housing, opportunity and resources, economic resources, whether it's jobs, transit access, tax base, and also education and conduit or social resources. In this particular case, social resources is looking at high-speed internet, but in other cases that could be looking at, again, churches, community centers, anything that allows residents within a community to form connections with their neighbors and other community members. On the right here, you see a map of one of the opportunity maps we've created in partnership with a couple other groups that is used by the state of California. Many of you are familiar with HCD. This is the map they use for tax credit allocations for low-income housing. And here we assign an opportunity score to every neighborhood in the Bay Area. And those, the areas that we assess as being high or highest resource in this case, receive a bonus in tax credit applications. And again, this can be used towards a whole kind of swath of policy issues, housing being one of them. And this is based around the first axiom I discussed earlier, which is that place matters. People aren't just confined to their own individual resources. They live in neighborhoods, they live in communities that have or lack amenities and resources for those individuals to utilize. As I said earlier, opportunity is a hard thing to measure directly, but what we can do is go back in time and test the attributes of different neighborhoods that led to people in previous generations achieving upward mobility. One of the data sets we have for this is based on a research project called the Opportunity Atlas, which was created by Raj Chetty, who I think is now at Harvard. And he measures the outcomes of people who were born between 1978 and 1986 and looks at what the attributes of community, what community attributes led to people having higher incomes as they reached adulthood. One of our general presuppositions is that if opportunity were equal, people born anywhere in the income distribution would have an equal chance of landing anywhere else in the income distribution as adults. What we see instead is that only 7.5% of children who are born in the bottom quintile, that's bottom 20% of income, are actually likely to make it into the top income. So that's about less than 5 times the chances of people who are born in the top income quintile already. And so we see that even from birth, people start at different places, and they tend to remain in those places even as adults with regard to the income distribution. Race is another factor here, where when we look at people as they move up and down the income distribution, we find that particularly Black children are much more likely to move down the income distribution than they are to move up. We can see the blue dots here kind of moving down. Those represent Black boys raised between 78 and 86. And the yellow dots represent white boys born in those years. And we see kind of a rather steady pace for the white boys born and a rather steady downward pace for the Black boys born in those years, which indicates that even for Black children who are born to parents of relatively high incomes, they tend to end up in lower income distributions in their own adulthoods. To apply this to the Bay Area specifically, one of the things we've seen over the past 40 years is that the Bay Area has become more diverse, but also more segregated at the same time, which is a concept that a lot of people find counterintuitive. We've seen a much larger percentage, particularly of Latino and Asian Americans, and in percentage terms and in absolute terms, the white and Black population in the Bay Area has declined. But even in spite of becoming more diverse as a region, the neighborhoods within the Bay Area have in some cases continued to be racially isolated, and in other cases become even more so. This is a map of redlining in the early 1900s in the Bay Area. And we can see that the redlining in the past correlates well with, or correlates with, racial distribution in the present. The areas that were redlined, you can see this in the green outline here, in the past continue to have much higher percentage of people of color, even today, many years later, than the rest of the surrounding areas do. A lot of these lines and demarcations have persisted into the present day. And we believe that this is due to a general pattern of the interaction between socioeconomic status and racial segregation, in which individual neighborhoods have something of a cyclical pattern, where they see lower educational outcomes, which leads to the more affluent members of the neighborhood to leave, which then leads to more racial economic segregation, which then leads to more segregation, and particularly in schools, again leading to lower educational outcomes. And this kind of cycle is a good explanation of why inequality, both across races but also throughout the general population, can often persist in the neighborhoods in which it is found. And I do want to note that this model doesn't require that any kind of racial animus exists between people. It doesn't require any type of racial hatred for racial inequality to persist and to be something that's caused almost organically by the systems that were placed, for specifically that reason in the past. We have a few key takeaways in our report. The key finding is that the Bay Area has gotten significantly more segregated in 2010 than it was in 1980, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. And to do this, we measure segregation at the neighborhood level throughout the Bay Area as the isolation or concentration of any racial group. And this has two benefits for us. One is that it captures the kind of classic conception of, say, Black people being concentrated into very specific neighborhoods. But it also has the benefit of measuring the logical consequence and inverse of that segregation, which is you have, outside of those neighborhoods, highly exclusive and highly isolated white neighborhoods. These two things come in pairs, and we often want to note kind of both sides of that coin. We also measure segregation two different ways geographically, which is intercity, being between different cities. Often different cities within the Bay Area will be tremendously different in terms of their racial demographics, but also intra-cities. Larger cities like San Francisco or Oakland can have very high divergence between different neighborhoods within them in terms of their racial demographics. And that's important because much of the segregation that exists in Bay Area exists not just within city boundaries, but also between them. And oftentimes cities are formed or were formed for that explicit purpose. Excuse me. This is one of the ways in which we've measured divergence in the Bay. And you can see that in most counties, we show a significant rise over time in the percentage of their neighborhoods that are, let's say, racially isolated. And all of this matters not just because it's maybe bad in theory to be segregated, but because segregation can have extreme consequences for the people who live inside of it. As part of our ongoing series on segregation within the Bay Area, we note that people who live in neighborhoods with high Black and Latino segregation are more likely to live in poverty. They're much less likely to have bachelor's degrees. They're less likely to graduate high school. Even life expectancy is much shorter. And also important to note is that even this even holds true in the areas we're able to measure across racial groups. So it's not simply that Black and Latino neighborhoods have, for instance, lower segregation, but Blacks and Latinos who grow up in predominantly white neighborhoods or neighborhoods with low segregation have a higher life expectancy than Blacks and Latinos who grow up in segregated neighborhoods. And that gets at the idea that it's not just kind of the people, it's also the situation that is causing a lot of these differences. Also important to note is that these income differences hold up even though the percentage of people who are in the labor force, particularly of men in the labor force, is very similar. One of the efforts we've made as a part of this report is to map segregation in the Bay Area. This is available publicly on our website. And we find that the neighborhoods that are segregated are not randomly placed, but are rather in pockets, which is roughly what we expect from the redlining example we discussed earlier. We also discuss possible solutions for remedying segregation. I do want to say up front, these are solutions specifically for the idea of segregation. There may be other goals that these do not achieve or even contradict, but these are solutions that we have found have real evidence for decreasing the levels of segregation in a particular region. The first of those is increasing the supply of housing, which we'll talk about a lot later, but particularly in curtailing restrictive land use policies such as single-family zoning and regulations and opening currently exclusive neighborhoods and communities. A second policy that can help with racial segregation is rent control and rent stabilization, which can alleviate the rising cost of living in vulnerable communities and help to prevent displacement, especially displacement due to short-term shocks in the population, which is important in an area like the Bay Area where so many people of higher incomes and means are kind of moving in and exacting kind of an innate pressure on the current population. There are also mobility strategies where we can directly support people who are moving into otherwise exclusive communities. Inclusionary zoning, which can reserve space in an existing community specifically for low-income residents, and affordable housing, such as low-income tax credits, like we discussed earlier. On the first point, we did a separate report, as part of our segregation report, we also mapped single-family zoning throughout the Bay Area at a parcel level. And we did this to assess the relationship between not just segregation in single-family zoning, but also single-family zoning and the opportunities and resources of the communities that experience them. We find a high prevalence of this in the residential areas of the Bay Area. Roughly 85% of the square mileage of the Bay Area's residential places is dedicated to single-family zoning, and a third of cities have a percentage of restricted family zoning higher than 90%. And I do want to iterate to emphasize here that this is not a problem with single-family homes per se. There are a lot of areas, particularly in the more rural regions of the Bay Area and of the country, where the market only demands a certain level of housing, and single-family housing is a completely appropriate solution. The problem that we see here is that restrictive zoning laws act to prevent people from actually accessing the resources that are locked into these neighborhoods, and they have an effect of keeping new entrants out and kind of isolating not just people racially, but also people economically into and out of kind of high opportunity zones. As a part of the single-family zoning report, we identify cities like Piedmont, Cupertino, Los Gatos, and several others as cities which would benefit from curtailing restrictive land use policies. They have over 90% of their land restricted to single-family zoning. 100% of their areas are taken up by high opportunity neighborhoods, and they're close to a central business district so that new entrants of multiple incomes would likely have jobs that are close by that they can access. We also find that single-family zoning correlates with race in exactly the way we'd expect from all the other slides. We see a sharp increase in the percentage of a city that is white when we get up to very high levels of single family zoning, which again is important only because it correlates with the amount of resources that people are able to access, as we've discussed here and earlier in the presentation. And we can see here in our report, we correlated single-family zoning restrictiveness with several other attributes: income, employment rates, educational outcomes. Not shown here on the slide, we also show environmental hazards and even backwards looking opportunity. And we find that restrictive land use policies correlate really well with people's ability to access all of those kind of neighborhood level attributes. Even looking back into the 80s in the Rod Chetty opportunity outlet status set I discussed earlier, we find that people are more upwardly mobile if they live in areas with restricted land use zoning and less upwardly mobile outside of it. And we find even looking back into the 80s, it's a pretty good correlation between single family zoning then and now, in part because those areas by definition have had much lower, much less land and housing development since that time. Again, this is part of an ongoing report that we've done looking at racial segregation and single family zoning in the San Francisco Bay Area. This is part of a 5-part series, or this covers a 5-part series in which we measured segregation, the different tools we have to look at it, its impacts on the people who live under it, and possible solutions for it, in addition to looking at single family zoning and all the things and resources it correlates with. With that, I'll wrap up my presentation, take any questions that come up, and thank you very much for having me.
Thank you so much, Arthur. That was really neat insight, really valuable framing on what opportunity is, why place matters, and all these different interventions that we can see for, you know, remedying residential racial segregation as it is today. Much of it aligns with some of the work that, you know, we've talked about at previous hacks, and also there's some new areas of discussion for us. So I'm really excited to get into questions and discussion. I know that some folks are typing questions in the chat. What we'll also go ahead and do is, if you want to use the Zoom raise your hand function, we can go ahead and unmute people to verbally ask questions or share, you know, a thought for discussion. The way that you do that is click the bottom bar of your Zoom screen. You'll click participant, and then next to your video screen will pop up a white panel, usually above the chat, where you can click raise hand. It's a little blue hand icon. So that's a way for us to know that you're interested in speaking, and we'll go ahead and take questions both from the chat and from there. Our one guideline for today is, you know, share the space. So whether if you're really accustomed to speaking up a lot, maybe share the space for others to speak up. If you are generally not the person who asks questions, we encourage you to share your voice and share your thoughts. So it goes both ways. All right. Now, I see one question in the chat, and then we'll get to the raise hands. Annie Wu is sharing, is single family zoning a correlation to upward mobility, or is it a cause or driver of it? Arthur, do you have some comments there?
Yeah, all we can say confidently is that it correlates. But assessing cause is really difficult in any research field, and so I don't want to overstate the issue. The only thing I will say is that the Opportunity Atlas team has found that moving into neighborhoods that they assess as high opportunity is causally related to people doing better later in life. And so whether that holds true in single family zoning, I can't necessarily say, but in general, being in a high opportunity neighborhood seems to be causal of doing better later in life, and at least in terms of income and education for that matter. And I don't see any reason why that would stop being the case in single family zoning.
Great. I've asked Anne Zeiss, apologies for all the names I'm going to butcher today.
You did fine. That was exactly how it's pronounced.
Oh, wonderful.
You must know a little German.
I must.
Yeah, the E's are totally silent. Anyway, I live in Milpitas. I run the community website. We're very proud here in that we're a chartered city in about 1955. When we made the charter, we forbid any kind of redlining or discrimination in housing because we wanted the Ford factory to move in here. It's now the Great Mall, if you know the area. But it was where Mustangs were made and what have you. And a lot of the workers there were blacks. So we wanted fair housing, and they wanted it to be good housing. Had to have hardwood floors and an attached garage was the prerequisite there. And I'd like to, every once in a while, someone says, well, are you still that way? I mean, the law is still on the books and has been for many, many years now. Has your study shown how Milpitas is faring as far as fair housing goes?
Well, so we have not done a lot of, we've done a lot of research on fair housing, but that's a fairly wide concept. And
okay,
so
whatever you want to call it, your discrimination.
Sure. I don't know off the top of my head what the segregation score of Milpitas was.
Well, I looked at your map and it was kind of like red, and I was surprised because we don't consider ourselves that way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So one thing I do want to note about our research is that we're not trying to assess people's intent, just what the situation is on the ground. So it's possible for a city or the neighborhoods within it to be highly racially isolated, even if nobody particularly intended it to be that way. That can happen because of economic forces that are on the ground that the whole Bay Area is experiencing, not just one city. Or it can just be because for whatever reason, people of a particular race didn't find opportunities in that area. So I don't want to say that like because a place is segregated, like the people there are bad or anything like that. But to answer your question, I don't exactly know what the racial demographics are.
Well, I think what happened, the area neighborhood called Sunny Hills was this neighborhood that was built for the Ford factory workers. And I think a lot of the families just stayed there. They just liked it. It is a nice neighborhood. There would be no reason for them to move elsewhere. And then the other parts are newer in Milpitas. They were built more in the 70s or 80s or even more recent. And we were attracting a lot of people, Asian and East Asian and white. My neighbors, as I go down the street, are everything in the all over the map. So I'm kind of going like, how in the world is this? How's the study being done? Is it how is it? How does it figure out?
Cool. Yeah, we can get into the weeds a little bit. So what we do for each census tract, which we use as a proxy for neighborhoods, a census tract typically has about 4,000 people in it. We assess the degree to which that tract is different in its racial demographics from the metropolitan area it lies within. I think for Milpitas, that's still the San Francisco, Oakland, Marin area. But,
no, not really. It's down near San Jose.
Okay.
All right.
Well, hang on. I'm going to try to share my screen here and look directly at it. I've got our segregation map open. So hopefully you're able to see that. So zooming out a little bit, yeah, it's grouped with the rest of Santa Clara County for the purposes of assessing segregation. And then if we zoom in here, we see that we have a few neighborhoods that are roughly medium in our index. And then other neighborhoods where we see a very high percentage of Asian Americans relative to the greater area. I'm not sure exactly what the Milpitas city boundary looks like, but that's kind of a general picture. And if we look at it over the past few decades, it looks like its demographics have roughly diverged from the Bay Area since from Santa Clara since the 1980s. I will also, for the benefit of people who are on the chat, paste the link to our map in case anybody wants to look at it in real time. Although I'm not sure I'll be able to answer all neighborhood level questions over the course of this presentation.
Mm-hmm. And we have quite a few comments in the chat. Thank you so much, Arthur. We have quite a few comments in the chat about some learnings from The Color of Law by Richard Rothstein as another resource for folks to learn specifically about Milpitas and exclusionary laws that were passed. So if anyone's interested in commenting further on that and the local context, feel free to raise your hand and use the Zoom tool to raise your hand so I can go ahead and unmute you. A really exciting resource there that a lot of us have learned from and enjoyed. I do have, and it was really neat to see that interactive, all the mapping there. I do have another guest. Paula, I'm going to go ahead and ask you to unmute and share your comment or question. And we're going to ask comments and questions to be kept to under a minute. And if there's a question, to get to the question.
I'm overwhelmed with all your data. So my question is, what's the thing I should take away today to really go, oh, let me focus on that? That's my question.
That's an interesting question because to some degree it depends on what you're trying to achieve in the world. In a broad sense, I think my takeaway from a lot of this research is to go back to the very first thing I said, is that place really matters for opportunity. And so when we think about something like racial residential segregation, it's not merely like the fact that people are isolated, but that people, individuals, families, they live in neighborhoods that have or lack resources. And when we think of policy, a lot of times we think about it at the individual level, which for the most part is a good thing, particularly when it comes to, say, the rights an individual has. But when we think about legislation in terms of trying to help people be upwardly mobile, to integrate communities, that can't disregard the amount of resources neighborhoods have and the ways in which people are excluded out of the neighborhoods that have the most resources. Thank you, Paula.
All right. And then we have Mary Jane.
Hi, thank you. And I love you guys. You're kind of a huge inspiration to me, the Othering and Belonging Institute. So, and SV at Home, just getting to know you guys, but glad you're around. I've been doing more in San Mateo County lately. So my question is, I mean, it took us 2 years in Palo Alto, where I live, to get, or 3, just to get accessory dwelling units. Like, it was a fight. That was for something so minimal, like a mother-in-law unit. And I guess I'm struggling, I would love to change R1 here at SingleFamily Zoning. And I'm wondering what your thoughts are on pathways forward. Like, do we need to think beyond our city limits? Do we need to develop regional governance models like Mid-Peninsula, or just, we have a county line issue here where East Palo Alto is very much connected to Palo Alto, but they're different counties. So it complicates things here a little. But I guess I'm wondering, like, or do we need a reparations project? How do we kind of move the ball rather than just continue to have these fights at city council meetings about this stuff to really address what you're talking about?
Thanks for your question. I guess I'm incapable of delivering simple answers, apparently, but I think there are 2 answers to that question. I think for you as an individual, participating at the local municipal level is probably the single most effective thing you can do, just because the tendency in almost all areas is towards inertia. And so at the local level, I'm sure those city council fights have been very frustrating for you. I've been in several that have seemed to go nowhere. But if you get one development put up, that can genuinely change the lives of a dozen families. And that's actually a really significant achievement, and one that's worth being proud of. At a policy level, I think those solutions have to come from outside the municipality if we're going to enact broad scale social change. This is the part, by the way, where I say that I am an individual who works at Berkeley. My views do not reflect the university or any of its other members. But I will say there every year there seem to be several potential bills that are aimed at addressing this problem, either via government solutions or via market solutions, and they tend to fail because of the opposition of various representatives of various California districts. And that can be something where you as a person makes an impact through contacting your representatives, letting you know you support whatever change is being looked at.
You know, I'll jump in really quick on this as well. David Meyer from Silicon Valley at Home. It's a great question there, Jane, especially about Palo Alto, where I have spent some amount of time working. And one thing that we're hoping to do at SV at Home is we're hoping to have a future hack where we'd like to bring in, because there's so much discussion around single family zoning and potential reforms to single family zoning. And there's a lot of discussions around stuff, especially happening in the city of San Jose, it's being referred to as opportunity housing. We're hoping to have a future hack in the next couple of months where we might bring in some people from localities and states that have already worked through this process. So, you know, Minneapolis is a big example. The state of Oregon is a big example. So we're hoping to ourselves continue the discussion on this topic and bring in some people who were directly working on successful campaigns in that, to help share some further ideas about kind of strategies that they used around messaging, around the policies. So I'll just say look forward to that. We hope to have, there will be much more to come on this, just because it's becoming an even bigger issue in Santa Clara County in general.
Thanks.
And I see some people are bringing up some questions in the chat related to, I think, the kind of the connection between the data and the analysis that the Othering and Belonging Institute has done and some of the other kind of big regional policy efforts that are underway. I see some folks asking about connections between this data and work to Plan Bay Area. And I don't know, Arthur, if there's anything you can talk about related to kind of how, you know, how this data and your research is being used and how you've been brought in on some of these kind of regional discussions to inform these big discussions. If that's been a part of what you've been working on since this has come out, because I'm sure everyone's been coming to you and trying to figure out how to use your use your data analysis in different ways. I don't know if you can speak to that a little bit.
Sure. I don't think I can talk about any of the specific examples, but at a large scale, I'd say we've been approached by a few municipalities, some of the larger ones in the Bay Area, and they've been, and we're happy to see it, really interested in promoting opportunity areas, allowing people to move into opportunity areas in a way that is conscious of racial differences. And I do think that's important because of the correlation I discussed earlier between race and resource that people experience. It's not so much that necessarily we need to move group X into neighborhood Y, but that looking at where a particular group lives is an additional way that we can get at the resources in a community, where resources can be put and where people can be moved to, so that we allow people a variety of experiences across race and across incomes.
Great questions. I'll pull another from the chat. We have Daphne asking about some of the data, and specifically that the tables about the effects of segregation on Black and Latinx populations is very informative. Are there tables that show the same data for white populations? I know that there are clear advantages to integrated schools and neighborhoods, but is there hard data to support this? And now this might be drawing from what you referred to from the Opportunity Atlas or Raj Chetty's research, but is there something, Arthur, you'd like to speak to what the data available is showing?
Yeah, the short answer is yes. The long answer is we did, as I said earlier, a 5-part report on this. So we do both reports on where white people, not on, but that include information on where white people have found themselves most isolated, and also what the effects of that isolation has been. I'm going to put in the chat box a link to the series of reports. Briefly, I think part 1 deals with the history of segregation, part 2 with the demographics, and then to the other part of the question, part 4 deals with a lot of the effects of segregation and isolation more broadly. We also have in the interactive map different indicators that can show the isolation or exclusion that people experience by race, if people are interested in breaking it down by a particular demographic group.
Fantastic. All right. We have another question about, changing the thresholds about how people are qualified to changing the thresholds for income and how much people make to be able to afford affordable housing. That might not be directly related to the policies being proposed. I'm wondering if anyone has comments on, how income thresholds are developed or shared in regards to being able to afford affordable housing. This is a question.
No, it's a good question. I think, sorry, David again here. I assume this question has to do with the fact that even at the Bay Area, just even when you are calculating, the different income levels, which is this is I'm not an expert on this, but and maybe someone who's a real expert can jump in. But the way that these, they're talking about the area median income levels and brackets as they're assigned. My understanding is that those categories are basically set by HUD. And so basically this question is hitting on the problem of being somewhere where the area median income is so high. And the question of being able to alter them in a way that's potentially more reflective of the actual costs, what it actually means to be low income or median income, because the question always comes up that you have people who might be in the moderate income category, but those people still can't afford to live in so many places in the Bay Area. I think there was I think it might have been in the Mercury News. There was a couple of months back, there was an analysis that was done, and it might have been drawing on a lot of the same data that basically said, there was a sliding scale of what's your income and where could you afford to live, and all around the different kind of based on Bay Area jurisdictions or census tracts. And even if you were making the median income, it was very limited where it was affordable to live. So I'm going to see maybe if I can find that somewhere. Maybe someone else also recalls this interactive graph. It was like it was a sliding scale I know this isn't exactly answering the question, but I think it's kind of getting to the just that, you know, it's a question that's around the money, and it's a big problem that we face here. Sorry, I see Kristen has a hand up.
Mm-hmm. All right, Kristen, you're up next.
Thanks for unmuting me. Just a short comment. Hi, Arthur. Love seeing you. Unconstrained by our many questions, Arthur is the Othering and Belonging Institute is doing amazing work in San Jose to try to develop a policy on where we site affordable housing. So, so that's exciting. Just a quick note on David's question and the person who asked that question. Yeah, I mean, the use of area median incomes, I mean, just technically speaking, HUD figures this out, passes it through to the state, and then the state modifies it slightly and issues it to each county. And then the county sends it to cities. Every city in that county uses that median income. Whether the indication of a 30% household expenditures should be spent on housing plus a reasonable utility allowance, that's a standard that the affordable housing industry uses. Whether that's the right standard or not, that's how affordable housing rents are priced according to the area median income for that county. But it's you know, the alternative measures as to how much things actually cost in our area. Yeah, I mean, I'm familiar with two, and this has come up just last week at work. One, the PPIC, the State Public Policy Institute of California, has an alternative, the California Poverty Measure, which tells you how much it costs to live in California. And there's also something called the California Self-Sufficiency Measure. And I don't think either one of those breaks it down by smaller geographies, although I could be wrong. And so we've been trying to find out if there are other kind of more regionalized measures that more accurately reflect cost of living generally. And then I think, David, that cool interactive feature, I think I saw it in the New York Times first, but I could be, or the Chronicle, it was a Chronicle with these interactive maps. That was kind of wild. So I'm not sure where they got their data. But it's a good question. It costs different amounts to live in different places. And obviously the places Arthur's talking about that are that are all single family, if you manage to get a rental in those areas, of course, they're through the roof. So we need to change that.
I found the article if people are interested. There was the Mercury News has it here, so I'm going to paste it in here.
Oh yeah, I think the Chronicle did something like this too. Very cool. Thank you.
Hi, Mitch Mankin from SB at Home. I can add a little bit more on that question of rents too. I think that as the area median incomes have increased in the Bay Area, the folks who build affordable housing have noticed that. And so there are various solutions that could help. Some is like targeting lower incomes or lower percentages of the area median income when building new affordable housing. That's one strategy. Another thing is, one way to keep people from being rent burdened is to pair the affordable housing with vouchers. This is commonly done, like a Section 8 voucher, for example, which covers up part of the amount the person is paying for housing, so they don't pay more than 30%. So that's a question that actually goes to a more federal level, which is how many vouchers are available. So the more we can advocate for having more housing vouchers available, the more people both inside and outside of affordable housing we can get to be paying less of their percent of income.
Great, thanks for those additional notes, Mitch. We'll take just one last question from Ruth Ferguson. I'll ask you to unmute and you can go ahead and ask your question. And then we'll wrap things up here.
Great, thank you. So Arthur, I wanted to ask you, on one of your slides, you said the problem is not single family zones, but restrictions that impede housing development. And later on, I know you identified housing development as kind of a solution. So I'm curious what you think about state mandates that permit slightly higher density in single family zones, like SB 1120 that obviously didn't pass the legislature. but was kind of, I think, kind of addressing partially this issue. And I'm wondering if there are any other like policy fixes that you have in mind, and kind of in particular, I'm thinking about statewide discussions on legislation like SB 50 and particular legislators who kind of constantly note that housing development often is in communities of color, and that communities of color often kind of carry the burden of these higher density units. So just kind of, it's kind of a big question, but I'm curious if you could respond to any of that.
Thanks very much, Ruth. I do want to clarify one thing at the top, because I might have misspoke during the presentation, but what I meant was that the problem is not single family homes and not single family zones, whereas we kind of define single family zoning as zoning from a municipality that restricts homes to single family. So you could imagine like a rural area, not very many people live there, and all the homes are single family. That's not a problem at all, because that's just all the market there calls for. What we do have a problem, not a problem, what we do think is an issue in kind of perpetuating downstream inequality is zoning that is enacted either by the municipality or the state that restricts development, particularly in areas of high resource where it would otherwise be built. I can't comment on what I think about specific bills, but we were reached out to and eventually helped create for the authors of SB 50 an opportunity map that, had the policy been enacted as they envisioned it, would inform where greater density would be incentivized. And that map included looking at areas of high opportunity, as well as noting areas that were at a particular displacement risk that might be places to either avoid or address specifically, let's say idiosyncratically through policy, to make sure that the displacement base was not affected. And so just in general, I'd say as an institute, where those bills come up, we try to look for ways that we can both make sure those bills are most effective for the new entrants who would come in, but also have the least amount of possible harm on the current residents who are most vulnerable to changes.
Awesome. Thank you so much, everyone, for your questions, your insight. Arthur, I don't know if you wanted to add any last final comments, or if you could let us know where we can find out more about you and the report and Othering and Belonging Institute.
No major final comments, though. Again, thank you very much for hosting me. This was a lot of fun. I rarely get to go deep into the weeds with such a large audience, so great to be here. As far as any other work, you can find all of what we do at belonging.berkeley.edu.
Fantastic, thank you. So we will be sharing a recording of this conversation and this presentation with all those who registered. And there's also been several really awesome links in the chat about other resources, books, articles, for folks to dig in more to the rest of this series, as well as this particular brief that Arthur presented on today. I encourage folks to check out the Othering and Belonging Institute website to also get a deeper dive into this work. And we will go ahead again, send out an email with a link later today or early next week. Please keep an eye out for information about our November hack, which will probably be the week of the 15th due to the holidays. And if you are not yet a member of SV at Home, we encourage you to visit our website and join as an individual member, or if you're part of an organization as an organizational member. SV at Home provides technical assistance, policy expertise, and advocacy related to policy furthering our affordable housing goals to ensure that everyone has a vibrant, equitable community to live in here in Silicon Valley. We have regular events just like this one as educational opportunities, and plenty of policy resources on our website too for those who want to just nerd out along with us. And we look forward to your continued participation. Arthur, thanks again so much for the time that you spent with us to share your research. It's really exciting to see that from different parts of the Bay and get a deeper dive into how we address racial residential segregation.